All right, so let's get started. Thanks, everyone. So a couple of disclaimers first. The first one is that, as was revealed at dinner last night, I'm not a political scientist. And the second is that, so what I'm going to do instead is actually try to give you just a brief sort of modern history of some landmark papers that have used genetic data in the political sciences in one way or another. I've also dabbled in this field myself, so towards the end of the talk I'll sort of give you my take on the whole thing and talk about some of my work in this area that uses Swedish adoptees. Okay, so I was thinking about what I wanted to say, and I decided to sort of divide sort of do a cartoon history of behavior genetic studies in political science and divide it into 5 phases. The first one of which is actually some pretty cool work that was done outside of political science in the 70s and mostly 80s. Then I'll talk about a 2005 paper that was published in Politics Science, and I think did more than any other event I can think of to make political scientists aware of these kinds of methods. I'll talk about an initial wave of candidate gene studies. I'll talk about a wave of backlash that both the twin studies and the candidate gene studies triggered when they became, when they started to become published in politics journals. And then I'll sort of end with some thoughts on what we can, with my own thoughts on how genetic data could potentially be useful in politics and point to some examples. Okay, so if one had to sort of pick a start date for this literature, I think it's a PNAS paper published in 1986 by first author is Nick Martin, who went on to found a large twin registry in Australia, and Lyndon Eves. This guy is a very impressive researcher who's one of really the founding figures of behavior genetics as it started to become reconstituted in the 70s and 80s. And really what they did was a prelude to many of the later twin studies in politics. They gathered data on social attitudes as measured by an index of conservatism in 2 very large samples of twins, one in Australia, one in Britain. They also gathered data on spousal correlations, and which they actually used to take assortative mating into account in their models, something that's not usually done when you estimate, it's something you don't see in the typical twin study. We'll talk tomorrow about the details of twin studies. And there were basically two major findings. The first was that MZ twins, monozygotic twins, were a lot more similar on social attitudes than GZ twins. And the second was that were actually substantial spousal phenotypic correlations, like of the order of 0.3, 0.4, a lot higher than you would have expected, and higher than what's been reported for pretty much all other, most other phenotypes. So the underlying samples were large. I have a figure. I think this may be the only figure with numbers that aren't legible, but I'll just roughly explain what the point is. They showed in the Australian sample, they showed monozygotic correlations per item on this 50-item battery, and they're sort of consistently higher, both in males and females, than corresponding correlations estimated in dizygotic twins. And for those of you who can read, a lot of these items, it turns out, the term that was used for them was social attitudes. It turns out that a lot of them are really about attitudes towards specific policy proposals, or what a political scientist would call political attitudes. For example, here's one, attitudes towards abortion, disarmament, etc. They did something very similar in the British sample, and in the British sample they actually constructed 2 scales. The first one was called radicalism, and radicalism, according to the paper, is just a way to try to measure where this person lies on the left-right political spectrum in Britain at the time. So this is supposed to be measuring a political attitude. And in the British sample, the sort of the pattern of correlations were very similar. Okay, and at the time, the paper went largely unnoticed. To my knowledge, nobody in political science really paid attention. And we'll talk about when that changed. First, let me say something, though, about the intellectual environment in which these findings were published. Today, and hopefully by the end of this course, it'll be fairly you won't be, nobody will be surprised to see these sorts of numbers. But in the 70s and 80s, it was still highly controversial. Here's actually a referee report that Eves quotes in the opening chapter of this book by Neil and Maes after he received a rejection from Nature on a paper measuring social attitudes. It's actually not clear from the chapter whether it's the paper that ended up being published in PNAS or something else. But here it goes. It's probably right to use the twin study to estimate the genetic contribution to variables which we know are genetic, like stature and weight. It's probably all right for things like blood pressure, but it certainly can't be used for behavioral traits which we know are environmental, like social attitudes. So that was a pretty widespread view at the time. I think it's changed a lot by now. And I think the intuition that this referee kind of expressed is one that we'll get back to, and we'll talk about what how to interpret these sorts of statements and how to interpret things like heritability of social attitudes, which sounds like a very odd thing to a lot of people the first time they hear it. How could something like social attitudes be heritable? And I think, just to preface the answer we're going to give tomorrow when we talk in greater detail about heritability, I think a lot of the answer is just to be precise about what we mean by heritable variation, and in particular, I think very often when people see these twin correlations, they assume that the claim that must be the claim must surely be that therefore these researchers are claiming that there are these genes with very proximal that they're impacting your political preferences through very proximal physiological pathways, and of course, one point I'll repeatedly make is that needn't be the case. All it's saying is that the genes are ultimately influencing social attitudes through some unspecified channel. Okay? Then, to my knowledge, very little happened, and in 2005 to 2008, and actually it's continued since then, there were a bunch of papers published. The first one was this paper in the flagship journal of political science, the APSR, and basically what they did was introduce these ideas to a politics audience. They reanalyzed the Martin et al. Data from Australia, and they got some more additional data from a sample that had subsequently become available called the Virginia 30K, and it basically showed again that there was this separation of the monozygotic and dizygotic correlations. Here's a key table from the paper. These numbers are literally calculated from the PNAS 1986 paper using a formula that we'll talk about tomorrow. It's called Falconer's formula, and we'll talk about where it comes from and in what conditions it delivers an unbiased estimate of heritability. And they repeated the analysis in a second new data set called the Virginia 30K. These samples are very large, I should say. One interesting thing about this is that the model used here to estimate heritability is actually cruder than the one used in the 1986 paper. But it's nevertheless sociologically interesting that these data has to be published in a politics journal in order for political scientists to start paying attention. And oh boy, did they start paying attention! There are two things happened. The first is that a bunch of researchers became really enthusiastic about these findings, and continued to do studies on the heritability of political attitudes and political behavior. There was a follow-up paper that looked at the heritability of turnout in 2008, and there were a bunch of follow-up papers that applied what are called multivariate twin methods to try to say something about genetic overlap between heritable variation and, say, your conservatism and some other dimension of your political ideology. Okay. Now, there was also a wave of critical backlash. I want to say something about it, and tomorrow we'll talk more about we'll talk more about criticism of twin studies. Now, before we do that, in addition to this sudden surge in interest in doing twin studies on political behaviors, there was also an early wave of candidate gene studies. We haven't talked a lot about what they are, but I think the basic idea is that you have some sets of genetic variants that you select, hopefully because of some believed biological function, you test for association. Okay, so back in '08, there were a bunch of these studies claiming genetic associations with various political behaviors. Okay, now on to the backlash. The backlash if I had to date it again, dating these things is a little bit arbitrary, but I think one paper that really opened up a big debate, and for those of you who know a little bit about what's happened in the 70s and 80s, when twin studies were still very controversial, it's kind of interesting to see history just repeat itself here. But if I had to date it, I would say that it was a 2008 paper by Evan Charney in the journal called Perspectives on Politics, I think. And one of the themes in my remarks about twin study estimates is that there's a tendency among both skeptics and advocates to really overstate their importance and significance. This was true both in the 70s and it's true still now. And there were really very strong claims being made. Here's just one example from the original paper saying that we would have to, if this is true, we'd have to rewrite all of human history and what it means to be human. Hopefully by the end of this course we will have convinced you that if this is true, properly interpreted, we won't be having to worry about rewriting history anytime soon. Okay, so I don't want to go into the criticism in detail. I just want to kind of zoom in on a couple of the critiques that I think turned out to be constructive. Tomorrow we'll talk a lot more about two important criticisms of behavior genetic estimates, what we call the Jenks and the Goldberger critiques, and they're on the problem sets. So there is a history actually of research, social scientists outside of behavior genetics making important conceptual contributions to behavior genetics. And unfortunately, I think many of the sort of lessons from that literature ended up being ignored by both sides in the debate that ensued. But I'll just very briefly tell you what the narrative of what went down. Okay, so there was a lot of resuscitating old arguments about methodological limitations of twin studies. If you do go back and read the exchanges, I guess I would urge you to think about one frustration I had rereading them the other day was just that a lot of the criticisms are not made in a sort of quantitative way. So any model, right, is going to make assumptions that aren't literally true, and really the task of the researcher is to say something about how sensitive the main conclusions are to reasonable violations of the assumptions. That's sort of sadly missing. A lot of the criticisms were of the character. The world is a complicated place. You're making simplifying assumptions. You're a reductionist, and that's kind of a vague type of criticism that you can make about anything. And in some sense, all science is reductionist. If reductionism just means that you have to simplify complicated things in order to distill the world and try to understand it better. I don't know what non-reductionist science would look like. But what I want to talk about, perhaps in slightly more detail, is that there was some criticism of these candidate gene associations, and they actually ended up being published also in the APSR in a paper that drew both widespread criticism and praise. I happen to think that the criticism is, that the authors were right to be critical of the claimed associations. And let me just show you one table from the paper. So they were pretty cheeky. They basically took the 4 genes for which there had been claimed associations, and they made a table showing everything that all the outcomes that these genes had been associated with. And I think there was even I think I saw a working paper version of the paper presented at the conference where they called the paper. I may be wrong about this, but I think they called it 4 genes are associated with everything. And you're about to see why. So here's table 1. This is page 1 of the table. So here are the 4 candidate genes. If you see any of these genes in a published paper, you should be really skeptical. And the reason is just that these genes before it was possible to inexpensively measure genetic variants at a large number of locations in the genome, these were sort of the usual suspects that people tried to measure. I think they're the ones that are available in AdHealth, for example. And so people ended up kind of testing the genes that were available for association, and the result was report after report claiming associations with pretty much everything, from academic achievements to altruism. Now, you'll notice that we've only made it to AL. They're in alphabetical order. And this was actually in the main paper. It's quite interesting. So this goes on to table 2, and we're still on A. And it goes on. And how many pages does it go on for, Patrick?
No idea.
What do you want to guess?
12.
12? You want the under or the over or the under on 12?
Over.
Okay, yeah, Dalton's right. If I counted correctly, it's 15 pages. Here's the last one, and there's voting behavior. So they were making the point that that these genes are associated with everything. Hopefully, by the end of this course, we will have sort of helped you develop more nuanced understanding of what the problem is here. You could imagine, in principle, right, that there are some genes that are associated with everything. That's not in and of itself a reason to reject the finding, but there are other strong reasons to be skeptical. I see a question.
There are a lot of empty spaces here. I mean, are they really claiming that everything is associated with everything? Marsh et al. There's only one utilitarian moral judgments.
Okay, so yeah, so for some of the outcomes, only one of the 4 candidate genes are implicated. That's true.
I don't know. Like, couldn't they have focused on voting behavior and political stuff and made a logical, short and compact point?
Well, yeah, so I do. First of all, it's remarkable that they managed to get a 15-page table into the APSR. That's probably longer than most than some papers that have been published there, and I don't know that it was the most effective way to make their point. I also don't think that it gets at the core of the issue, like namely what the problem with the candidate gene studies is, namely low power and poor controls for stratification. But we'll be a lot more precise about those things later on. So my take, the candidate gene studies were indeed flawed. I haven't really gone into details as to why, and I don't think that the original criticism did it always clearly spelled out what the problem was. I think the rest of the debate that has ensued hasn't been very constructive, and that's really a shame, because often having intelligent critics is a good thing. I think the key problem, and this is the reason I mentioned this debate, I think the key problem is that the key terms and concepts were very precisely defined, and so you just had it back and forth where they just kept talking past each other, and that's never a good thing. If you have a scientific disagreement with somebody and you can't even agree on what empirical test you would need, even if it's just a hypothetical experiment or something like that, to ultimately resolve who's right and who's wrong, then it's not clear. You need to be doing something differently, because whatever you're doing isn't leading to much progress. Okay, so that's my take on this all. Now, so that was the backlash, and I think I think this wave of criticism was quite effective in stopping new people from entering the field. Like, unlike sociology and econ, where my guess would be that more and more people have sort of gradually gotten involved, I'm not sure that's true in politics, and so I want to sort of, but there are some people who've kept working on these things, and so I want to say a little bit about the sort of work that's being done, and I'll actually illustrate it with one of my own papers. But before I do that, let me just actually briefly jump to an econ paper, because it turns out that the econ paper provides a nice framework that we'll be using actually in our own application to politics. One of the issues that we wrestled with in preparing the first day schedule was that it's natural in many ways to divide up these talks by disciplines: sociology, politics, psychology, etc. But to a very large extent, the methods are common. There's only one social science, really, and it's a little bit odd to say that something is politics just because you put turnout on the left-hand side, and it's economics because you put some earnings on the left-hand side, but you're applying the same method. But be that as it may, so quick digression into econ. Okay, so I want to talk about a work on adoptees done by Bruce Sacerdote, published in 2007 in the QG. What he did was he gathered survey data from a large sample of Korean-born American adoptees. Okay, so he got information about their adoptive parents and their adoptive parents' biological children. Okay, and in the data set he had access to, the adoptees had actually been assigned to families using a plausibly random mechanism. Specifically, I think parents were allowed to express a preference for a boy or a girl, but other than that, he provides at least some evidence that there wasn't any obvious selective placement or attempt to match the child to adoptive parents whose characteristics are correlated with the birth parents. Okay, and that's really important because that means, and this is the reason I'm mentioning this paper, that means that you can actually deal with genetic confounding in much more convincing ways than in the normal situation where you have parents who are raising their biological children. Because there, if you observe some relationship between biological parents and the rearing parents' outcomes and the child's outcomes, it's really hard to know what accounts for those relationships. So what Sacerdote does is basically he actually runs 3 types of analyses. One of them we'll save for tomorrow and talk about. That's the variance decomposition. But the first thing he does, he just says, okay, what's the relationship between the adoptee's outcome and the parent's outcome? If I measure it in an adoptive parent, how does that relationship change if instead the parent's characteristic, in children who are raised by their biological parents? So there's both a biological link and an environmental, social link to the parents. And the reason he can do this is that some of these adoptees were adopted into families where the parents also had their own birth children. Okay, he also thinks of proposes thinking about the adoptee's outcome as a result of an experiment where the children are assigned to families with different characteristics. And in his example, he divides the families into sort of 3 discrete, mutually exclusive categories. One of them being large families where the parents have low education. There's a medium category and there's a high category for children assigned to families where the parents are highly educated and the family is small. Okay, now what that means is that you can actually give the coefficient estimate beta 1 a causal interpretation. You can start making inferences about the effect of being assigned to a high SES household as opposed to a low SES household, and in a way that actually allows us to bypass some of the interpretational challenges with conventional twin studies that we'll talk about tomorrow. So this is really nice because there are a lot of settings in social science, in politics or otherwise. I'll show you an example from politics shortly, in which we want to know about causal factors that influence different outcomes. That's a hard empirical challenge because one of the reasons is that there's going to be a lot of just unobserved factors that may be correlated with things like household income or whatever causal factor you're interested in studying. And so the adoptees are by no means, there are going to be issues also with this research design, but it's a clever way to get around, in a reasonably plausible way, the issue of genetic confounding. Okay, the criticism that maybe you're just observing the relationship with household income because high-income parents differ along some dimension, genetic or otherwise, that we don't observe. Okay. In the treatment effective regressions, we're also going to have this z vector that conditions on the factors conditional on which that controls the factors conditional on which the children were randomly assigned. So in Sacerdote's case, that's just the sex of the child and some age and birth cohort controls. Okay. Okay. So first, just you'll be tired of seeing these kind of data by the end of the very consistent with what's been shown in twins and other types of siblings. It's always the case that the correlation between pairs of biological siblings, so siblings who are biologically related and raised in the same household, are a lot more similar than pairs of siblings where one is adopted, that are genetically unrelated. For example, because one was adopted and one is a birth child. And you see this for pretty much all of the outcomes that you look at. When you compare the transmission coefficient from parent to own birth child to the transmission coefficient from parent to an adopted child, you consistently see things in this area. That is to say, you see much stronger transmission from parent to child when there's a biological relationship between the parent and the child than when there isn't. Okay? And one way to interpret that is that there's some genetic factors that drive some of this similarity. You can also ask questions like, what happens to the relationship between a factor like maternal income, maternal education, or in this case, parental income, and how does that relationship vary depending on whether it's estimated in adoptees or own birth children, non-adoptees. And here, for example, you see a very typical result, which is that children who end up, because some of these children actually reach adulthood before Sacerdote gets to survey them, children with higher incomes, own birth children with higher incomes consistently, on average, were raised in families with higher incomes. Among adoptees, the relationship is more flat. One way to interpret that is that this sort of cross-sectional relationship estimated in own birth children overstates the causal impact of income. Okay, so now let's talk about this in the context of a political variable. So basically, with Sven Oskarsson and Magnus Johannesson, I repeated the same thing, gathering data on Swedish adoptees who were born between 65 and 75. So at the time, there were actually a fair number of adoptions. Unfortunately, because one of our measures was, our outcome was measured in 2010, we had to restrict the sample to children whose mothers were still alive in 2010. And so with that restriction, we were able to find about 2,000 adopted children for whom we have information about the adoptive mother, and also any own birth children, both to the adoptee's biological mother and the adopted mother. So relative to Sacerdote, one issue we have to wrestle with here is that that these children were not randomly assigned to families. There's going to be some selective placement. On the other hand, one advantage we have is that we actually observe the biological parents of the adoptees. And the reason you can do this is that in Sweden has this multi-generational registry that actually keeps track of the both all adoptions and everybody and pretty much the entire population's biological parents. And then
didn't what's her name, the Swedish economist at Stanford, make the claim that there was plausibly random, but conditional on a couple covariates, random assignment in Sweden?
There definitely wasn't random assignment. I mean, so I know that because I went back and I read the placement manuals from the 60s that they gave to the social workers, and they say things like you should try to find, if the child is blonde, you should match him to somebody who could.
Conditional on those
things. Yeah, that's very hard to say. So what I'm going to argue is that if you condition all the characteristics of the biological parents, you don't have a lot less information than the adoption agency had. And so whatever SCS variation remains is a lot more independent and a lot more exogenous than anything you would see in families with non-adopted children. I wouldn't want to make any stronger claims than that. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to look at transmission in families where the children are biologically related to the parents who raised them. We're going to do the same thing then for adoptees, and we're going to ask so if you have an adopted child, what is the transmission from the birth parent of the child, so the biological parents of the child, and the rearing parents of the child? And so under some assumptions, you can interpret the the coefficient alpha 1 is capturing broadly pre-birth factors, so factors determined before birth, and alpha 2 is measuring post-birth factors. Okay. The last thing we're going to do is going to run these Sacerdote-style treatment effect regressions that basically say that try to answer the question, what is the effect of being assigned to a household with a certain type? And unlike Sacerdote's setting, I don't think that this is going to be perfect, but I do think it gives us an estimate that is a lot closer to the true causal effect than what you would get from just regular observational approaches. Yeah.
So for the outcomes you're generally looking at, are you looking at them in the cross-section? Do you get to observe these voting behavior or anything?
We observe it as a single election in 2010. Yeah, that's all we observe. Yeah. That's just a limitation of the data. Okay, so let me show you just what it looks like, and I think these results are pretty typical of what one finds in the BG politics literature, but they're a little unusual because we're looking at adoptees and as opposed to twins. Okay, so I'm going to focus on mothers because there's much more often there's missing information about the biological fathers, and that's how we designed the study from the outset. We sort of selected a sample where all the mothers, both biological and adoptive, were known. Okay, and so here we see that being if the adoptive child, and I use this term child loosely because by 2010 they were 35, 40 years old, something like that, okay, just younger generation. An adopted child is about 4.4 percentage points more likely to vote if the biological mother who gave them up for adoption is a voter, and about 5 percentage points more likely to vote if their adoptive mother, the mother in the household where they were raised, was a voter. The transmission from adoptive mother is there, not very precisely estimated, and it's a lot weaker than the transmission you see in families where the parents are biologically related to their children. We also look at we also whether we also tested for interactions between these two things. I should say here, so in the G/E talk that Jonathan will give later this week, I think two themes that are quite likely to come up are that the G/E is potentially extremely interesting, but there are two major methodological hurdles. The first is that if you're using single genes, single genes are typically going to have such small effects that it's really, really hard to see how most studies would be well powered to detect interactions. And the second is that it's really hard to sort of isolate some plausibly exogenous component of the rearing environment that allows you to really make causal statements about this being a true interaction as opposed to just some artifact. Okay, so we think that going forward using polygenic scores is going to be an important way around that problem. You just aggregate a very large number of SNPs into a single score, and that means that with a few thousand observations you might have a little bit better hope of finding something. But there's another approach, which here is to just use the biological parent's phenotype as a proxy for pre-birth factors. And that proxy is roughly 100 times more predictive than what you could plausibly expect to get out of a candidate gene in the best case scenario. And on top of that, we do have a setting where there's a lot of independent variation in the environment being created by this adoption event. But nevertheless, I want to flag that it may still not be enough for a fully well-powered study seeking to identify interactions. Okay, but nevertheless, what we're showing here is that you could basically basically I'm showing you here the effect relative to a child whose biological mother and adoptive mother did not vote of being assigned to 3 different types of families. This tells us and basically what this negative interaction, this is just the interaction between an indicator for biological mother voted and adoptive mother voted. And at least in our data, it appears to be the case that there's some substitutability between the two. That is to say, if I'm assigned to a household where the biological mother voted, I'm about 18 percentage points. If my biological mother voted, I'm about 18 percentage points more likely to vote. If my adoptive mother voted, I'm about 16 percentage points more likely to vote. If both of those things are true, however, but those two things don't add up. But these things don't appear to act additively independently in our data. Okay. So then the last thing I want to just say something. Yeah.
How do you substantively interpret the fact that you have this negative interaction, this substitutability, and not complement, not additive?
So what this regression is showing is that there are 4 types of children.
No, I get
okay,
what
yeah.
you're saying in terms of the numbers, but I'm saying like substantively,
what's
your theory of why?
I don't have
Given we think.
Okay, so one
like environment is substitutable for genetic endowment.
That's one way to interpret it. There's an important kind of statistical sense in which this could be. That could, how should I put it? This could be partly an artifact of the fact of the fact that the baseline level of voting is already quite high, right? And then it could be a ceiling effect, is what I'm trying to say. And so, but I don't know how to answer the question. How do I interpret it? I interpret this indicator variable as somehow capturing pre-birth factors. I interpret this one as capturing post-birth factors, and they don't seem to add up in terms of the treatment.
I think it has to be a ceiling effect because the intercept is 0.86, which means that you basically.
That's regression adjusted though, so I think these numbers is what you want to do.
This is a linear probability model.
But it,
Yeah.
but it basically looks like a ceiling effect.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't look like you could go 30%.
But and that's something we actually talk about in the paper. This is it's almost a philosophical question as to whether you want to call that, huh?
Not logistic regression.
This is from a linear probability model, but we do the other. We probe it as well. It doesn't change anything. Yeah, the results are the same. Okay, so then we also just look a little bit at the relationship between different family characteristics and different transmission coefficients in regressions of child turnout on maternal characteristics, separately for own birth children and adopted children. And the tendency here, the only point I wish to convey is that you get numbers that are lower. So here in each of these numbers is the coefficient in own birth children followed by the coefficient to adopted children. And the point here is just that the family household variables are more predictive of the child outcome if there's a biological relationship between the parent and the child. Okay. Now, and that we find quite consistently. And what does that tell us? Well, it tells us something that we didn't know before about the sort of likely causal mechanisms. And as Tassadot points out, remember he just divided the families into 3 types of groups. So even if you find that being assigned to a family with highly educated parents, something like that, has a large effect. That doesn't mean that it's the educational attainment of the parents themselves that's causing the that's causing the increase in turnout. It could be something correlated with maternal or paternal education, but it does bring us some way towards getting more precise understanding of specific mechanisms that you couldn't get otherwise. And maybe the most, if I were to use a single number to summarize the conclusions of this slide, we construct some composite measure of SES, and the one standard deviation increase in that measure is associated with an increase of 7 percentage points in turnout of biological children, own birth children, and about half the effect in adopted children. So why did I tell you all of this? Well, I told you all of this because I think it's one illustration of how you can try to use genetically informative research designs to try to get more credible answers to sort of social scientific questions about the effects of different environmental variables. And you'll remember towards the end of Dan's talk, he gave three ways in which genetic data could potentially contribute to economics. The first was it could shed light on biological mechanisms. The second was that genetic data could prove useful in a lot of empirical research. Even in empirical research where you're not fundamentally interested in genetics, you may just be interested in controlling for genetic confounds, so to get a more credible answer to some question about, say, the effect of household income on children. And the third is gene by environment. Is that the availability of genetic data can allow you to start studying how environmental factors can mitigate or amplify genetic risk. So this was just one example. I think that by now that there is a dozen or so papers that try to use genetically informative research designs that have been previously applied in psychology or econ or other or in behavioral genetics to deal with genetic confounding. Increasingly, people in political science are starting to use polygenic scores. One problem here is that they're typically limited to using polygenic scores not for outcomes such as turnout or political ideology, because they're just not available yet. The data don't exist. But of course, you can use polygenic score for things like educational attainment. For example, our friend my colleague Chris Dawes, has a paper showing that even within siblings in the Swedish data, the PGS for education predicts turnout. There are other ways to try to control for unobserved genetic heterogeneity. For example, the SIB fixed effects approaches. And those two are being used a lot. So there's a very commonly used identification strategy to compare monozygotic twins who differ in terms of some exposure, like education. I actually want to caution a little bit about interpreting those estimates too uncritically, and because there's a very important distinction between the random assignment of genotype that we talked about earlier and these sorts of studies. So just to make matters concrete, suppose you do a study that asks whether in monozygotic twin pairs the more educated twin is more likely to vote. And suppose that you find that he or she is, and then you conclude that therefore education has some causal impact of turnout. So there's a crucial difference between that type of research strategy and a research strategy that uses, say, within family polygenic score to estimate the effect of genotype, in some reduced form sense. And the difference is that we know, we have this experiment of nature that ensures that conditional on genotype, it's very reasonable to assume that conditional parental genotypes, the children's genotypes are going to be randomly assigned. That's not true here. It's not that somebody flipped a coin and told one of the MZ twins to get more education than the other. Something caused one MZ twin to get more education than the other one. And there's absolutely no reason to suppose that that variation that you're using in these sorts of studies isn't going to get you closer to a causal estimate than to the causal effect than just the cross-sectional relationship with income and a bunch of controls. That may sound surprising to some of you. I'm happy to talk about it more if it's weird. The last thing I'll mention is also that even though the sort of initial attempts to find genetic associations with political variables, I hope by the end of this week we'll have convinced you were based on samples that were way too small. There are other types of methods you can use to to estimate the joint effects of genetic variants. Matt Keller will talk about them in his lecture. Okay, so I'll conclude with just two remarks. The first is that at a very general level, I think the contributions, the potential contributions of using genetic data here are identical to those that Dan listed for economics, mechanisms, non-genetic empirical work, G by E, but of course the settings are slightly different. Political scientists study a different set of, they're interested in why do some people have, what accounts for differences across individuals in their political ideology, why do some people vote, etc. Other than that, the findings from the politics literature so far very much fits what's been found for other traits. Everything is heritable, and most behavioral traits are highly polygenic. The heritability, I think, properly interpreted, is not that shocking. It doesn't require any rewriting of history. But it's important to explain what it means and what it doesn't mean, and we'll deal with that issue at length tomorrow. It's a very important one. I think research designs that reflect the reality that most of these single SNP, that these traits are highly polygenic, meaning that individual SNPs have very small effects, are more likely to be successful. Concretely, what you can do to bypass the single SNP power problem is to either aggregate them into polygenic scores or do things like adoption and twin studies, where you're usually estimating the effects of some latent genetic variable that captures all the genotypes. And finally, I think that after some unsuccessful, unproductive bickering, the literature is sort of getting there in the sense that this is the people are sort of moving in the direction of using genetic data in constructive ways. Hopefully we'll have opportunity to talk about many more applications throughout in the next, in the coming 2 weeks. So I'll stop there and hand over to James, I think.